The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, and she almost didn't answer. She didn't recognize the number at first. It was saved under a name she'd abbreviated so long ago she'd forgotten what it stood for. But she picked up, and the voice on the other end was completely, unnervingly calm. It was Joel, Cassie's husband. He said, "I'm not calling to start anything. I just need to know if my wife was actually with you last Saturday." Mara had been covering for Cassie for 11 months. 11 months of, yes, she was with me. 11 months of, we just lost track of time. 11 months of being the alibi for a woman she had known since they were 19 years old, sitting in adjacent dorm rooms, sharing everything. And Mara had a lot to share. She was generous with her trust. She always had been. But something about the way Joel asked that question, not accusatory, not desperate, just steady, made her stop before she answered. She had rehearsed versions of this moment in her own head, told herself that if it ever came to this, she would say yes one more time, for Cassie. Because that's what you do for someone you've loved for 15 years. She didn't say yes. She said, "Joel, I think you need to talk to Cassie." And then she stayed on the line long enough to hear the quality of his silence before she ended the call. Now, if you want to know where this goes, and I promise you, you do, hit subscribe and tap the bell. Because around here, we don't leave a story half told. And this one is the kind of story that makes you look very carefully at every friendship you have ever been generous to. Let's keep going. Mara and Cassie had been best friends for exactly the kind of length of time that makes a friendship feel like a fact of your life, rather than a choice you're still actively making. They'd met at university, survived terrible roommates and worse relationships together, stood in each other's weddings, Mara as Cassie's maid of honor, Cassie as Mara's. They were the kind of friends who didn't bother explaining their history to new people, because the history had become its own shorthand. Cassie was, and Mara would say this was part of the problem, enormously lovable. Warm in the particular way that made you feel she had been waiting specifically for you to arrive in whatever room she was already in. She remembered the names of your cousins. She sent cards for things that didn't technically require cards. She was the first person Mara had known who made her feel both completely seen and completely safe. Which is maybe why it took Mara so long to notice what was actually happening. The first time Cassie asked for a cover story, it was so small it barely registered. A spa day that had apparently run longer than expected. Joel had called Mara first, not suspiciously, just checking, and Cassie had already texted ahead. "If he asks, I was with you until 6. Mara said yes without thinking about it. It seemed, at the time, like the minor social friction that couples navigate constantly. She hadn't asked why. She assumed she'd hear about it eventually. She never did. The second time, the third time, they started to blur. A Friday evening, a Sunday afternoon, a weekend trip that apparently didn't go quite where Joel thought it went. Each time, Cassie's request arrived wrapped in just enough warmth. "You're literally my person, I don't know what I'd do without you," that Mara found herself agreeing before she had quite finished deciding. This is the part Mara has turned over many, many times since. Because she was not naive. She knew, in the way you know things you aren't yet ready to say out loud, what the cover stories probably meant. She had the particular discomfort of someone who has connected every dot, but put the pen down before finishing the picture. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself Cassie would explain when she was ready. That whatever was happening inside that marriage was complicated in ways Mara couldn't see from the outside. That being a good friend meant not asking questions that might break something that wasn't hers to break. But the thing about covering for someone for 11 months is that at some point, the lie stops being hers and starts being yours. And by the time Joel called on that Tuesday afternoon, Mara was already in the picture. Whether she had chosen to be or not, Joel did not call back that evening. Cassie did. 4 times in the space of 40 minutes, starting approximately 9 minutes after Mara had ended the call with her husband. Mara watched the screen light up twice before she answered. She needed a moment. She needed to decide, before she picked up, who she was going to be in this conversation. Cassie's voice, when she finally got through, was not angry. It was the specific register of someone trying very hard to sound confused. Slightly breathless, slightly hurt. The tone of a person who has prepared for this moment and chosen their opening carefully. What did you say to him? Not hello. Not, are you okay? Not even, I can explain. Just, what did you say to him? And Mara, who had been asking herself that same question for 40 minutes, sitting at her kitchen table with her phone face down and a cup of tea she hadn't touched, said, I told him to talk to you. There was a pause. Then Cassie said, Mara, I needed you. And there it was. The sentence Cassie had always known would land exactly where it was aimed. Because Cassie knew Mara better than almost anyone, knew the specific texture of her guilt, knew how quickly she moved to smooth things over, knew that I needed you had always been the phrase most likely to make Mara question every decision she had just made. It had worked for 11 months. But something had shifted in that Tuesday afternoon silence on the phone with Joel. Some wire that had been under tension for a very long time had simply, quietly, given way. Mara said, I know, but I can't keep doing this, Cass. This is the moment where the story splits in two. Because what Cassie did next revealed something Mara had not fully understood about the architecture of their friendship. Something that, once visible, could not be made invisible again. Cassie did not cry. She did not apologize. She did not ask Mara how she was doing, or acknowledge even briefly that Mara had been carrying something heavy for nearly a year. Instead, she began, calmly, methodically, and with the particular fluency of someone who had clearly rehearsed this possibility, to reframe the situation entirely. According to Cassie, Mara had agreed to help. Freely, without being pressured. Which was technically true. According to Cassie, the things happening inside her marriage were complicated in ways that Mara, who had, let's be clear, a good marriage, a straightforward marriage, a marriage without the specific difficulties Cassie was navigating, couldn't possibly understand. And according to Cassie, what Mara had done by not covering for her this one time, after 11 months of doing exactly that, was a betrayal. A betrayal. Mara stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. She listened. She said very little. And when she finally ended the call, she sat for a long time with the specific feeling of someone who has just watched a building they thought was solid reveal in a single moment that it was held up by something much less permanent than they had believed. Here is what Mara knew about Cassie's marriage, assembled over years of careful listening. Joel was not a dramatic man. He was a civil engineer. He coached their daughter's weekend football team. He had a particular habit of double-checking that everyone had ordered what they actually wanted before he let the server walk away. A small thing. The kind of small thing you notice about a person and file away as evidence of character. Mara had always liked him. Not in any complicated way. Simply in the way you like a person who is consistently, reliably decent. She had asked Cassie once, gently, carefully, about 18 months before any of this began, whether everything was okay at home. Cassie had said yes, of course. They were just in a bit of a slow patch, the way all long marriages went slow sometimes. Mara had nodded and moved on. She had not pushed. She had not asked what specifically the slow patch looked like, or how long it had been going on, or whether there was something Cassie needed. She had assumed, because Cassie was Cassie, that if there was something she needed, she would say so. She said so, 11 months later, just not in the form Mara had been imagining. The mutual friends heard about it within a week. Mara hadn't told anyone. Not her husband, not her sister, not a single person in their shared circle. But Cassie had. And the version of events that travelled was this. Mara had been covering for Cassie, yes, but she had done it willingly, enthusiastically even, because she had known about the affair from the beginning and had never once raised a concern. And then, for reasons Cassie described as complicated and hard to explain, Mara had suddenly decided to stop. At the worst possible moment, when Cassie needed her most. In this version of the story, Mara was not the friend who had held a secret too long out of misguided loyalty. She was the friend who had gone rogue, who had, essentially, chosen Joel, a man she barely knew, over 15 years of friendship. And that detail, the one that seemed small, is the one that makes everything else make sense. Because here is what you need to understand about Cassie. She didn't just need cover stories. She needed the story to be true. And if Mara had been complicit, genuinely complicit, enthusiastically complicit, then Cassie wasn't hiding something shameful. She was just living her life, surrounded by people who supported her. Mara's hesitation on that phone call hadn't just ended the alibi. It had threatened the entire narrative. The first message came from Priya. Priya had been part of their friend group since the four of them, Mara, Cassie, Priya, and a woman named Dana, who had moved to Portugal and largely faded from the group chat, had spent a summer subletting the same apartment in their mid-20s. Priya was the kind of person who said exactly what she meant, which Mara had always loved about her, and which now meant that her message was not softened at the edges. I just want to say, I've heard Cassie's version. I'd like to hear yours, if you want to talk. Mara stared at that message for a long time, because it told her two things simultaneously. The first was that Cassie had been busy. The second was that Priya, careful, clear-eyed Priya, had not simply accepted what she'd been told. She called her that evening. What Priya said, once Mara had walked her through the actual sequence of events, was quiet and precise in the way that Priya's observations always were. She said, "Mara, this isn't the first time Cassie has done this." Mara didn't say anything. She waited. You know when she and Dana had that falling out? The one nobody ever got the full story on? Mara remembered it vaguely. 7, maybe 8 years ago? Dana and Cassie had been inseparable for about 2 years, closer for a period than Mara and Cassie had been. And then, abruptly, without any public explanation, Dana had simply withdrawn, moved across the friend group's social perimeter, stopped showing up, eventually stopped being invited. By the time she relocated to Portugal, the distance had already been established for years. Mara had always assumed it was one of those friendship implosions that happened quietly, the way plates shifted underground before anyone felt the tremor. It was not that. According to Priya, who had pieced this together slowly, over years, from things Dana had said in the months before she left. Cassie had needed something from Dana too. Not alibis specifically, but something adjacent. Dana had been the person Cassie called when she needed a witness to a version of events that hadn't quite happened the way Cassie described them. A dinner that had apparently gone differently than Joel remembered. A conversation at a party that, in Cassie's retelling, had required a certain amount of corroboration. Dana had gone along with it, for a while. And then she'd asked a question, Priya didn't know which one, that Cassie had apparently never forgiven. Within 3 months, Cassie had quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly repositioned Dana within the group. Not through any single dramatic act, through the slow accumulation of small ones. A comment here about Dana's reliability. A raised eyebrow there about something Dana had said. The gentle, consistent suggestion that Dana was perhaps a little difficult, that there was something slightly off about her, something that was hard to put your finger on, but that you'd probably noticed if you were paying attention. Most of them had, because Cassie was the kind of person you trusted to read other people accurately. She was warm, she was perceptive, and she had always seemed to be operating from a place of genuine care. If Cassie thought something was a little off about Dana, you found yourself, almost without deciding to, looking for the thing that was a little off about Dana. Mara had done it too. She sat with that for a moment before she let Priya continue. I want to pause here for just a second. Because if something about this story is sitting in your chest in a specific way right now, you know the feeling. You're not imagining it. Drop a heart emoji in the comments if you've ever stood up for someone, carried something for them, and then found out you were the one being carried as a story. Okay, back to it. Because this is where things start to shift. Mara spent the 3 days after her conversation with Priya doing something she had never done before in the context of this friendship. She went back through everything. Not obsessively, not in the way of someone trying to build a case, in the way of someone who has been handed a new piece of glass and is holding it up to a window they've looked through 100 times and is noticing, for the first time, the way the light comes through differently. She thought about the friendships that had gone quiet over the years. Not just Dana. There had been a woman named Bex from Cassie's work who had been warmly integrated into their social world for about 18 months before she simply stopped being mentioned. Mara had barely registered it at the time. Bex had seemed, in retrospect, she could now hear Cassie's framing in her own memory, a little much, a little intense, the kind of person who made things about herself. She thought about whether she had actually believed that, or whether she had simply received it. She thought about the year Cassie and Joel had gone through what Cassie had described as a rough patch, the one Mara had been careful not to push on. How Cassie had, during that period, needed Mara more than usual, called more, dropped by unannounced, required a quality of attention that Mara had provided readily because that was what you did. And how, once the rough patch was apparently over, Cassie had moved back into her life with Joel without ever quite explaining what the rough patch had been. She thought about whether there had been someone else, even then, whether the covering had started earlier than she realised and she simply hadn't been given the explicit script yet. She thought about Joel, steady, decent Joel, and what 11 months of unanswered questions had felt like from inside that house. And she thought about something Cassie had said to her years ago that she had filed at the time under the kind of thing people say when they're being honest about a flaw and laughing it off. Cassie had said, "I just need people to be on my side. I know it's a lot, but I genuinely can't function when I feel like someone isn't fully with me." Mara had found it endearing at the time. She found it considerably less endearing now. The thing Mara kept returning to, the thing she could not quite put down, was the specific efficiency of what Cassie had done after the phone call. She had not panicked. She had not reached out to Mara in genuine distress. She had not asked even once how Mara was doing with all of this, with the year of carrying something that wasn't hers, with the phone call she hadn't been prepared for, with the position she had been placed in without ever being asked whether she wanted to be there. She had gone straight to the narrative, straight to the story she needed the people around her to believe, with a speed and a fluency that suggested this was not a new skill, that she had done this before. The rapid reframe, the preemptive strike, the version of events deployed before the other person had time to organize their own. And here is the thing about watching someone do that, really watching it up close for the first time. It does not feel like betrayal, exactly. It feels like recognition, like the particular chill of understanding that the warmth you experienced was real. It was real. And it was also, simultaneously, useful. That you were loved, genuinely, and leveraged, methodically. That those two things were never in conflict for Cassie, because for Cassie, they were simply the same operation. Mara had been the alibi. She had also been the proof of concept, the evidence Cassie carried of her own lovability. And the moment she stopped being useful, the moment she told the truth on a Tuesday afternoon, she had become the problem. That detail had been sitting in the middle of this story the whole time. Now you can see it too. Dana was not hard to find. She had a quiet online presence, a photography account, mostly landscapes, the occasional picture of a meal she had made in her Lisbon apartment. Nothing personal, nothing that invited conversation. The kind of social media footprint that belonged to someone who had decided at some point that the less visible she was, the better. Mara had not spoken to her in 4 years. She sent a message on a Wednesday morning. Short, careful. She did not explain everything. She wasn't sure she had the right to, not yet. She said only that she had been thinking about the way things had ended between Dana and the group, that she was sorry she hadn't reached out sooner, and that if Dana ever wanted to talk, she was there. She didn't expect a reply for days, if at all. Dana replied within the hour. I wondered when this would happen. I'm glad it's you. They spoke for 2 hours on a Thursday evening. Mara at her kitchen table with the same untouched tea she seemed to keep making herself in moments of reckoning. Dana on a balcony in Lisbon, with the ambient sound of a city that had nothing to do with any of this. Dana was not bitter. That was the first thing Mara noticed. She had expected some version of bitterness, the residue of a friendship that had ended badly, the specific edge of someone who felt they had been wronged and never properly acknowledged. But Dana was simply clear. The way a person gets when enough time has passed and enough distance has accumulated that the thing they lived through has finally lost its ability to destabilize them. She told Mara everything, not in a rush, methodically, the way someone describes a thing they have turned over many times and finally understood from every angle. It had started for Dana with something small. Cassie had asked her to confirm a version of a conversation, a disagreement with a mutual colleague, that Dana had witnessed but that had not gone quite the way Cassie was describing it, just slightly off. The details adjusted in the way you might adjust a photograph. Same image, same people, same general composition, but the light changed just enough to make everyone look a little different. Dana had gone along with it. It seemed, at the time, like the kind of minor social smoothing that people did for each other constantly. She hadn't thought of it as lying, exactly. She had thought of it as loyalty. She had thought of it as exactly what Mara, years later, had thought of it as. The requests had escalated gradually, the way these things always do. Never a sudden leap, always a small step, each one made possible by the fact that the last one had been taken. By the time Dana found herself in a position she genuinely could not navigate, corroborating something about Joel specifically, something that would have required her to look a decent man in the eye and mislead him about something that affected his life in a real and lasting way. She had already been walking in a particular direction for so long that stopping felt like a rupture. She stopped anyway. She asked Cassie directly what was actually going on. Not aggressively, not as an ultimatum, just, "What is actually happening here, Cass? Because I need to understand what I'm covering for." Cassie had not answered the question. What Cassie had done instead was go very quiet. Not the warm, attentive quiet that Mara knew, but a different kind, a cooler kind, and say, "I thought you were someone I could trust." And then she had gone to work. Dana described it the way Mara now recognized it. The efficiency of it, the speed, the fluency. The way the narrative arrived in the group before Dana had processed what was happening. The way she had found herself, without a single loud confrontation, without any dramatic scene, simply and gradually on the outside of something she had been at the center of for 2 years. "The thing about Cassie," Dana said from her Lisbon balcony, with the particular calm of someone who has earned that calm at considerable cost, is that she genuinely believes it, every time. She isn't performing the hurt, she actually feels it. The moment anyone stops giving her what she needs, she experiences it as a betrayal, which makes her very convincing, because she's not lying about the feeling. She's just lying about everything that caused it. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long did it take you to see that?" Dana said, "Longer than it should have. Less long than it would have taken me 5 years earlier." After the call, Mara sat with something she hadn't fully anticipated. A feeling that was not quite anger, not quite grief, but had elements of both. It had the weight of grief and the temperature of anger, and underneath both of those, something older and quieter. It was the feeling of someone revising a large document. She was going back through 15 years of a friendship and looking at each memory. Not to decide it was false, because it wasn't false. The warmth had been real, the history had been real, but to understand it differently. To see the architecture underneath the warmth. The way Cassie had always needed to be the most trusted person in the room. The way any challenge to her version of events had always been framed as a failure of loyalty rather than a difference of perspective. The way Mara had always, quietly, made herself smaller when she and Cassie disagreed, had softened her own position, had found her way back to Cassie's side, without ever quite deciding to. She had not been brainwashed. She had not been the victim of something exotic or extreme. She had been a generous person, in a friendship with someone who had learned very early that generosity, in the right person, could be reliably converted into compliance. Who had found in Mara something she needed, a warm, loyal, believable person, and had kept her close accordingly. The friendship had been real. The selection process had also been real. Both of those things were true simultaneously. And holding both of them at once was, Mara would later describe it to her husband as, the most exhausting clarity I've ever experienced. The group chat had gone strange by the second week. Messages that would ordinarily have included Mara, plans for someone's birthday, a link someone found funny, the low-stakes daily texture of a friend group that had been operating for over a decade, had started to arrive with a slightly different energy. Not hostile, just careful. The way a conversation gets when someone at the table knows something that hasn't been said out loud yet. Priya texted separately. They're waiting to see which way it goes. Nobody wants to pick wrong. Which told Mara everything she needed to know about the social economy she was operating in. This was not a group of people being cruel. This was a group of people who had, over many years, absorbed a particular lesson. That the cost of being on the wrong side of Cassie was social and real, quiet and devastating, and who were now doing the completely human thing of protecting themselves while they assessed the situation. Mara did not blame them. She also understood, for the first time, that she had spent 15 years absorbing the same lesson. She had just been close enough to the centre that she had never had to act on it. Until now. Joel called again on the Friday of that second week. He was still calm. Mara was beginning to understand that calm was simply the register he operated in. That it was not performed, not strategic, just him. He said he wasn't calling to put her in the middle of anything. He said he appreciated that she hadn't lied to him. He said, and this was the part that stayed with Mara long after the call ended, I don't think you knew what you were in the middle of. I think she's very good at making sure the people around her don't quite see the whole picture. Mara said, I think you're right. I'm sorry it took me this long. Joel said, you were a good friend to her. That's not the same thing as being wrong. After she hung up, Mara sat for a long time with that sentence. Because it was generous, and it was precise. And it also contained, tucked quietly inside it, the thing she had been circling for 2 weeks without quite being able to land on. She had been a good friend to Cassie. She had just been a good friend to a version of Cassie that Cassie had constructed specifically for her. And the question she was now asking herself, the one she couldn't answer yet, the one that would take considerably longer to resolve than any of the more obvious questions, was not, how did I not see this? It was, who was I in this friendship when no one was asking anything of me? Because that version of herself, the one who existed in the in-between moments, the ordinary Tuesdays, the lunches that weren't covering anything for anyone, that version had genuinely loved Cassie, had been genuinely known by her, and had genuinely known her in return. And you cannot just set that down. Even when you understand, finally and completely, what was underneath it. You carry it differently, but you carry it. The thing that finally moved Mara from reflection to decision was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the phone call with Joel. She was at the supermarket, in the cereal aisle, when her phone buzzed with a notification from a platform she barely used. A community events page, the kind of thing she had joined years ago and never properly left. Someone had tagged her in a comment thread. She almost didn't look. The thread was under a post about a local fundraiser, something low stakes, a charity auction for the primary school their children had both attended. Cassie had commented, and in the middle of an otherwise ordinary exchange about donation logistics, someone had asked Cassie directly whether Mara would be involved, since Mara had organised the previous year's event. Cassie had replied, I honestly don't know what's going on with her lately. She's been a bit all over the place. I hope she's okay. 7 words, delivered in the particular tone of concerned distance. Not accusatory, not cruel, just worried. The way a good friend might be worried about someone who was going through something. The way a person who cared deeply might describe, with gentle reluctance, a friend whose behaviour had become a little hard to explain. Mara stood in the cereal aisle for a full minute, phone in hand, reading those 7 words. Then she put her phone in her pocket, finished her shopping, drove home and sat at her kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she had conducted every significant reckoning of the past 3 weeks, and made a decision. She had not, until this point, told her version of events to anyone except Priya and Dana. Not to the wider group, not publicly, not loudly, not in the form of a counter-narrative designed to reclaim her reputation. She had stayed quiet in the way she had been staying quiet for 15 years. The way she had learned, inside this friendship, to manage herself. But the comment in the thread was not about the affair. It was not about Joel, or the phone call, or the 11 months of cover stories. It operated completely independently of all of that. It was simply Cassie, with a light touch, in a public space, planting a flag. Establishing, for anyone who might ask later, that Mara had been off lately. That her behaviour had been difficult to read. Preemptive. Efficient. Entirely in character. And Mara recognised it. Finally, fully, without any remaining ambiguity, as the same move that had been made on Dana. The same move that had been, she now understood, available to Cassie at any point in their 15-year friendship. Held in reserve, deployed only when necessary. She had just never been necessary before. She called Dana again that evening. Not for advice, exactly. More in the way you call someone who has already been where you are standing, who has already navigated the specific geography of this particular decision, and whose voice you need to hear before you take the next step. Dana listened to the story about the comment thread. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She did something similar with me. A post about a dinner I wasn't at, with a comment about how it had been a bit awkward without getting into why. Just enough to make anyone reading it feel like there was a story. Not enough to be accused of anything. The thing is," Dana continued, "you can't really fight it directly. If you come out swinging, you look exactly the way she's describing you. All over the place, reactive. She's very good at setting up conditions where the natural response looks like the problem." Mara said, "So what did you do?" Dana said, "I stopped performing for the room. I stopped trying to manage how I looked to people who were going to believe her anyway. I just said what was true, clearly, to the people who were genuinely asking. And then I let time do the rest." She paused. "It's slow, it's uncomfortable, and it works." Mara thought about that for a long time after she hung up. She thought about the people in the group who were waiting, still waiting 3 weeks in, to see which way it went. She thought about the ones who had sent careful, neutral check-in messages that were warm enough to maintain the relationship, but vague enough to avoid commitment. She thought about what it would mean to simply be honest with them. Not strategically, not as a counter-move, just honestly. She thought about how foreign that felt. How much inside this friendship she had learned to manage her own truth. To present it in the form most likely to be acceptable to Cassie, most likely to avoid friction, most likely to keep the warmth uninterrupted. How rarely, in 15 years, she had simply said what she actually thought about something Cassie had done and let the chips fall. She had loved Cassie. She had also, quietly and incrementally, made herself smaller to sustain that love. And she was done making herself smaller. She didn't make an announcement. She didn't post anything. She didn't send a message to the group chat. What she did was reply individually to the people who had sent her the careful, neutral check-ins. Each message was different because each relationship was different, but the bones were the same. She told them, simply and without drama, that she couldn't be Cassie's alibi anymore. That she hadn't ended the friendship. She had told the truth to a man who asked her a direct question, and she stood by that. That she understood if they needed time to process the situation, and that she was not asking anyone to choose. She said only what she could prove. She named no names beyond the people directly involved. She did not describe Cassie's psychology, did not reference Dana, did not characterize the pattern in the broad, sweeping terms she could now see it in. She just said what had happened, in her own words, clearly. It was, and she would think about this later, with something approaching dark amusement, the most radical thing she had done in 15 years of friendship with Cassie. She had simply described her own experience, without softening it, without reshaping it to protect anyone's feelings, without checking first to see how it would land. It landed differently for different people. That was the honest truth of it. 2 people from the group replied with warmth and without qualification. Said they appreciated her telling them. Said they had wondered about some things. Said they were glad she had reached out. One person replied with a brief message that contained the particular temperature of someone trying to stay above the conflict and finding it harder than they had anticipated. 2 people did not reply at all. Mara had expected something like this distribution. She had not expected how much lighter she would feel after it. Not resolved, not clean, not the particular satisfaction of a situation wrapped neatly at the edges, but lighter. The specific lightness of someone who has stopped carrying something that was never theirs to carry, who has set it down, carefully, in the place where it actually belonged, and walked a few steps without it for the first time in a very long while. Priya called the morning after Mara had sent the messages. She said, "I want you to know something. I've been thinking about the way things went with Dana, the way none of us pushed on that, the way we just accepted the framing and moved on." She paused. "I don't think that was our finest hour." Mara said, "I was part of that too." "I know," Priya said. "That's kind of the point." There was one more conversation. The one Mara had been circling since the beginning, since the Tuesday phone call, since the moment the wire had finally given way. She had not spoken to Cassie since the night of the 4 phone calls and the conversation that had ended with Cassie's particular silence. She had not blocked her, not formally ended anything. She had simply stopped. The way you stop a habit that is no longer serving you. Quietly, without ceremony. Cassie sent a message in the 4th week. Not an apology. Mara had not expected one and would not have known what to do with it if it had arrived. It was longer than Mara had anticipated. It covered, with considerable skill, the ground of Cassie's own difficult circumstances. The marriage, the unhappiness inside it, the particular loneliness of a situation she felt she couldn't explain to anyone. It described, in careful and genuinely moving terms, what Mara had meant to her, what 15 years had meant to her. It did not, anywhere in its considerable length, contain the words, "I'm sorry for what I put you through." It contained, instead, a version of the story in which both of them had made choices they weren't proud of, in which Mara's part in those 11 months was weighted equally with Cassie's. in which what had happened was not something Cassie had done to Mara, but something that had happened between them. A mutual failure, a shared grey area, something that required understanding from both sides if there was ever going to be a way back. Mara read it twice. Then she put her phone down and went for a walk. She walked for 40 minutes. She thought about 15 years. She thought about the warmth, the real warmth, the genuine history, the woman who had stood beside her and meant it at the time. She thought about Dana on a balcony in Lisbon, having earned her clarity at considerable cost. She thought about Joel, steady and decent, living inside a version of his own marriage he had been carefully kept from understanding. She thought about the comment on the fundraiser thread. A bit all over the place. She thought about the document she had been revising for a month. 15 years of memories, seen now with the new light coming through differently. And she thought about all the small moments of self-erasure she had committed in the service of keeping things warm. All the times she had landed back on Cassie's side without deciding to. All the times she had quietly, carefully made her own truth a little smaller so it would fit. And she thought, I don't think I can go back to that room. Not because she hated Cassie, not because the 15 years hadn't been real, but because she now understood something she could not unknow. That the version of herself that had existed most fully inside that friendship was a version that had learned, slowly and without realizing it, to need Cassie's approval, to trust her own perception. And that version of herself had done enough work. She had done enough covering, enough softening, enough arriving back at someone else's side. She walked home. She made tea she would probably not drink. She sat at her kitchen table, and she didn't reply to the message. Not that day. Not the next. Not the one after that. Some silences are not passive. Some silences are the most precise thing a person can say. And Mara had, finally, found her words. The fundraiser happened without her. Mara saw the photos in the way you see things now. A quiet scroll on a Sunday morning, the algorithm delivering a life you used to be part of in the same neutral tone it delivers everything else. Cassie was in several of them, smiling, warm, her arm around someone Mara didn't recognise. The caption was cheerful. The comments were full of heart emojis. Mara looked at the photos for a moment. Then she kept scrolling. She noticed, and this surprised her the first time she noticed it, that it didn't hurt in the way she had expected. There was something there, a low-frequency ache, the specific register of a loss that hasn't finished settling. But it was not the destabilizing pain she had anticipated. It was more like the feeling of looking at a photograph of a place you used to live, somewhere you had genuinely loved, and understanding that you no longer belong there, and that understanding being somehow okay. She had expected to feel more broken. She felt instead strangely solid. The solidarity happened gradually, the way real things do. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. Priya came over for dinner in the 6th week. They talked for 4 hours, the way old friends talk when they have decided to be honest with each other about something they have both been circling for years. Priya said things about the friendship that Mara had not known she had noticed. Mara said things she had not known she was ready to say. At the end of the evening, standing in the doorway with her coat on, Priya said, "I think this is the most clearly I have ever understood you," which probably tells us something. Mara thought about that for days, about how much of herself she had kept at a manageable volume inside the friendship with Cassie. How much of her own opinion, her own perception, her own easy and unself-conscious way of being had been turned down just slightly, just enough so as not to create interference. She had not noticed herself doing it. That was the part that stayed with her longest. She had not made a conscious decision to be smaller. She had simply, over years, learned the dimensions of the room she was allowed to occupy, and had arranged herself accordingly. The way you arrange furniture to fit a space, without ever questioning whether the space itself could be different. The room had been warm. That part was true. It had also been, she could see this now from the outside, precisely sized. Dana flew back for a week in November. They had not seen each other in person in over 4 years, and Mara had been slightly nervous about it. Nervous in the particular way of someone who has rebuilt a connection over phone calls and messages, and is not entirely sure the in-person version will match. It matched. They sat in a wine bar on a Wednesday evening and talked for 3 hours. And it felt, Mara would later tell her husband, like the kind of conversation that reorganizes something. Not just about Cassie, about the whole category of friendship, about what it meant to be genuinely known by someone versus strategically known, about the difference between warmth that costs you nothing and warmth that quietly costs you everything. Dana said, "The strange thing, and I know this sounds odd, is that I'm grateful for it. Not for what she did, but for who I became after. Because I stopped being someone who could be leveraged, and I didn't know I had that in me until I had to find it." Mara said, "I think I'm at the beginning of that." Dana smiled. "I know. I could hear it in your voice the first time you called." Joel filed for divorce in the early autumn.